Hey guys, what's up? I'm going to talk about Dunkirk today, and contrary to how I usually do my reviews, I'm not going to spend too much time on the plot here, since one, this film doesn't really have all that much plot, and second, it's a very well-known movie just coming out right now, but it's probably one of the biggest movies of the summer, people saying it's a major Oscar contender, and you probably already know what it's about. This is the newest film by acclaimed writer-director Christopher Nolan, and it's about the famous Dunkirk evacuation. It took place during the Second World War in 1940 to be exact, when, after the invasion of France by Nazi Germany, thousands of Allied soldiers retreated to the French seaside city of Dunkirk, and as the surrounding British perimeter kept shrinking, the soldiers awaited evacuation in a seemingly hopeless situation. The film's narrative follows three major threads covering different periods of time, one beginning on land and covering 1 week, one taking place on sea and covering 1 day, and one taking place in the air covering 1 hour. These are interwoven in a non-linear narrative. And obviously it doesn't come as any surprise that eventually these three narrative threads intersect with each other, but in a way that I thought was so much more interesting, and in a way that I thought was actually quite fresh when compared to other films that kind of try to do this similar thing, because you start seeing events taking place during one narrative thread from the point of view of a character, and then later on you see the exact same thing happening again from a different point of view of another character during another narrative thread, and eventually it all clicks and it all makes sense because you realize that even though the film is edited together to make it seem like all of these events are happening at the same time, they are actually not, and it's obvious why, because the part on land, which takes place during a week, it's actually the part that starts earliest, and then that part actually catches up to the other two, and basically it's like the last hour. It's you could say it's the climax of the film, it's the grand finale of the film, in which all three of the events do end up actually taking place at the same time. And in my humble opinion, that's absolutely the cleverest idea Christopher Nolan came up with when making this film. You know, instead of opting for, the very standard, like, fractured narrative in which we could have followed the guy around on land for, like the first 40-50 minutes of screen time, and then eventually cut to the people on the boat and follow them around for like 40-45 minutes, and then eventually cut to the guy on the plane. But no, he opts for this sort of cross-cutting between parallel actions that are actually, like I said, not taking place at the same time, but the way the film is structured and edited, it makes it feel like it's happening at the same time, and so the illusion is definitely 100% convincing, and I think it really gives the film this immediacy it needs, and it really makes you feel like you're at Dunkirk. It really makes you feel like no matter how much time you spend there, no matter if you're there for a week or if you were there for an hour or a day, the sense that this is a ticking time bomb ready to go off at any second was something that was very apparent and was something that was very ever present. And this whole ticking thing is actually a major part of this entire film, and the film is not even subtle about it, not even in the slightest. I mean, the soundtrack is composed by Hans Zimmer, and if you're familiar with his work, especially with his work written for other films also directed by Christopher Nolan, you might already know that ticking is actually a major part of the music he composes for these films. And in this film he used a sort of auditory illusion named the shepherd tone. It's when several tones are separated by an octave layered on top of each other, with the highest pitch getting quieter, the middle pitch staying in the same range, and the lower bass pitch actually getting louder. And since we are constantly hearing two tones rising in pitch at the same time, our brain perceives this as a constant ascending in tone. And since Christopher Nolan's mission with Dunkirk was to create this film that just constantly got more and more and more intense as it went along, it was really important to have music that corresponded to that idea. And so Hans Zimmer's idea to use this auditory illusion to make us like feel that we are constantly, like ascending and everything just constantly getting more and more and more intense, even though it's not, it's an illusion. I really thought it worked spectacularly in Dunkirk. So as far as structure goes, as far as the soundtrack goes, as far as sound mixing goes, this film is absolutely an excellent piece of work, and pretty much absolutely everyone seems to agree with that. So it is objectively agreed upon that this film, as far as filmmaking goes, is a spectacular piece of work. But what about characters? What about story? Well, that's where certain opinions differ. Certain people were kind of disappointed of this film. There are not many of them. They are actually quite in the minority, but still, some people didn't like this film all that much, and that was because they blamed it on lack of characterization, on lack of character development, lack of character arcs, lack of characters in general. And while that's definitely a frustration I understand, it's by no means a frustration I share, because in my humble opinion, one of the reasons this film is as strong as I think it is precisely because it lacks characterization. I really do think that this is a film you really have to understand how to watch. When you really start to think about it, this film is pretty peculiar. It's very different from other war movies. I definitely even think that Dunkirk is kind of became a sort of own genre of war movies. It's definitely a war movie. It's definitely a combat movie that's unlike any other combat movie ever, because it's actually not about the conflict. There is no conflict. It's all about survival. It's all about the escape. It's all about running. It's all about fleeing. And that's the thing, that you have to understand that these characters are not actually characters. They are not actually based on specific people who were actually there in Dunkirk. Rather, they are sort of like avatars. Rather, they are sort of like these vessels taking us through this experience. And that would definitely explain why the film feels like it kind of lacks a second act. It feels more like a collection of setups and payoffs rather than an actual arc. And obviously this was all intentional. I mean, Christopher Nolan really wanted to create a story of suspense in a very like less is more sort of style, and in a way that's very much visual, and it definitely explains why the film lacks character development and lacks dialogue. There's not a lot of dialogue in the film. And I think it's very interesting to hear him talk about his influences in films that influenced him when making this film, from obvious examples like other war movies such as All Quiet on the Western Front, to some other not so obvious examples such as Hitchcock films, such as The Wages of Fear by Clouseau, and even certain action films such as Speed and Unstoppable. And actually finding out that those type of action films were part of the influence for Dunkirk really didn't surprise me in the slightest, because there is actually a certain little like action movie that came to my mind while I was watching Dunkirk. You might have even heard about it. It's called Mad Max Fury Road, of course, and it didn't come to my mind just because of the reason that it also features Tom Hardy with a thing on his face for a large chunk of the film. Okay, it might have been for that reason as well, but it's actually also for a completely different reason. Remember when that film came out, people were quite confused about Max's character in the film. I mean, people were wondering like, okay, what is his connection and what is this film's connection to the other films in the franchise in which, what's his name, Mel Gibson played Mad Max? I mean, is it the same character? Is it a different character? Is it taking place in the same universe? Is it a reboot? Is it a prequel? Is it a sequel? What is this? And my interpretation, and I think the healthiest and the most logical explanation for that is that Mad Max in these films isn't really the character, isn't really the person about who these stories are about. He is actually also a sort of vessel. He's actually also a sort of avatar for us, for the viewers, taking us through this world, taking us through this universe. So think about these characters more as tourist guides rather than actual people, okay? It might help. And the thing is that just because the film lacks character development, just because it lacks character arcs, I mean, characters here really don't make decisions, like they don't make life-altering decisions, they don't learn lessons. It doesn't mean that the film lacks a characterization. And one of my favorite characters in the film is the character played by Cillian Murphy, who appears in the second narrative thread that takes place during one day, and we're just taking place on the sea. You see, he is a shell-shocked soldier who is the sole survivor of a ship that was attacked by a U-boat, and the people on the small boat who are coming back to Dunkirk to help evacuate people spot him and they save him, and he is shell-shocked. He is not himself. He is very, very like agitated and aggressive, and he does definitely not want to go back to Dunkirk, while all the rest of the crew are saying that it doesn't matter what you want, this is what we're doing, it's our duty. So they get into like a fight, and he actually ends up hurting one of the small boys on the boat. And immediately afterwards, his reaction is incredibly human. It's just incredibly like unmovie-like, because he actually a little bit starts coming back to his senses and starts realizing, oh, look at what I've done. I'm obviously I'm not myself, and obviously I'm doing something wrong here, and I'm being overly aggressive. And what happens to him is so incredible, because he just becomes a non-character for the rest of the film. He just goes away and he goes into his corner and does absolutely nothing for the rest of the entire film. And I like that so much, because in another, like, cheesy, corny, standard film like this, that character would have eventually became, like the mustache twirling, like Saboteur, sabotaging the others because they want to go back into battle and he doesn't, so he's gonna ruin their plans. But here, that's not what happens. It's just these people are not against each other. They're just acting incredibly impulsively, and they're just trying to do the right thing. But in times like these, it can be doing the right thing can be something incredibly like gray, something incredibly hard to pinpoint. And that's probably the main reason I think this film works so well, is that it completely manages to avoid any sort of like sentimentalities or theatrics, and completely manages to avoid being about the backstory, and completely manages to be about the experience. Because you see, that's why this film is called Dunkirk, and that's why it's not called, like Saving Private Average Joe. It is about the experience. It's about people showing you the experience, and when people show you and talk to you about these sorts of experiences, they're not going to talk about who they have back home waiting for them. They're not going to talk about their mothers or their girlfriends or their families. They are going to talk about how they ran around that beach, how they flew airplanes, and how they were shot at, and how they hid in boats and in ships, and how they were cold and hungry, and how they were suffering, and how they were seeing people around them dying all the time. That's what they were going to talk about, and that's what this film really manages to show you, and to take you in and to take you out quickly and convincingly. And I loved it. I like this film very, very, very much. Oh, and another thing I just remembered to mention is that I thought it's incredibly interesting, something that I only realized after coming out from the film, is that we actually never get to see any Germans in this film. We actually never get to see the enemy, and that also like ties into the whole film. Like how I said, it's a lot more about survival. It's about running. It's about fleeing. It's about escaping. It's not about conflict. It's not about battle. And that's what happens. That's how it is. That's the experience. When you're running away from someone, you're escaping. You're not looking back to like stare at them and watch them and to see them. You're just running for your life. And I can also really appreciate a war film that avoids the trap of presenting us the enemy as if they were like cartoon characters. Like other films released recently, like Hacksaw Ridge, for example, which I criticized for presenting us Japanese soldiers as nothing more than just these sort of like ghouls or goons or savages or monsters or whatever you want to call them, that just run at you and then scream and shout. And I always find it to be incredibly disrespectful, and I'm really glad that this film also managed to avoid that cliche and that trapping. So props, man. So that will be my 2 cents on Dunkirk, folks. I am sorry if this review is a little bit like scatterbrained. I actually freestyled it. I didn't write anything down. I just had a couple of notes, so I wasn't really prepared for it, but I just wanted to talk about this movie because I liked it very much. So my question to you guys would be, what is your favorite war movie? Now, I'm really interested in knowing that because I'm a huge fan of war movies too, so please don't disappoint me. Leave your comments down below in the comment section. And thanks for watching my review. As always, if you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so I can see you later with other reviews. And until then, folks, you know the drill. Stay cool, stay awesome, and goodbye.